Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Tom Secker joins the show today as we compare and contrast two movies, War Machine and Charlie Wilson's War. We talk about Afghanistan, wars, history, geopolitics, movies, the involvement of the national security state in the entertainment industry, and more. It's a great in-depth conversation. It's both interesting and informative, both serious and lighthearted at varying times, and it's packaged into 2 episodes, published separately this week, or available in full in advance for patrons. Tom Secker is a writer, researcher, podcast host from Northern England. He specializes in the intelligence services, Hollywood, and the history of terrorism. He hosts the Clandestine podcast, and he's the author of 2 books, including National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. Find his work and ways to support that work at spyculture.com and patreon.com/Tom Secker. We recorded this on October 18th, 2018, and this is part 1. Hello, Tom. Welcome to Around the Empire. So great to have you.
Hi, Joanne. It's good to be talking to you.
I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and I found the analysis that you've done with others on movies and, just on the movies themselves and on propaganda and on the, let's say, cooperation between the military and intelligence services with Hollywood. Just some really interesting stuff. What we decided to do today was I had contacted Tom and I said that I'd love to talk about the movie The War Machine. And that's a Netflix movie, and it's based on Michael Hastings' book, The Operators. And Tom suggested a way to enhance that, which I thought was great, which is to do a compare and contrast with the Charlie Wilson's War movie, which is from a different era, but, we both thought that there were a lot of interesting comparisons between the two. So I think maybe the way to approach this is just to do some high-level comparisons and then get into some details of the movie. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
And I've also got some audio clips for us that I'll play at the appropriate time. Scott Horton, for people who don't know him, he's from the Libertarian Institute, and he's been a radio host, and he does podcast interviews. He's done thousands of interviews with just so many different people it's just a really valuable archive that if you're not familiar with his work, for our listeners, you should definitely check that out. And I talked to him the other night, and then I asked him if I could use a couple of clips from 2 interviews that he did with Michael Hastings. He did a number of interviews with Hastings. They were sort of friendly. One of them is a year before. Well, I should say first, the book, The Operators, there was an article more than a year before that called The Runaway General, which resulted in Stanley McChrystal's firing by President Obama. And, there were some sensational things about it, but it really painted a picture, and it revealed some things about not only our war policy, but the relationship between the Obama administration, the civilian leadership, and the military leadership. But anyway, so about a year before that article was published in June of 2010, Hastings talks a lot about some of the underlying issues here. This wasn't just something that sort of, was an impulsive thing for him. He'd spent a lot of time on the ground in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And then I have one other clip that is actually from the night that the Runaway General article was published. And Michael Hastings is in Kandahar at that point in time. So you can imagine, which is kind of interesting, right? When Washington's sort of freaking out about this article, and, the McChrystal team, we know from the movie, is also freaking out about it. And Hastings is still in Afghanistan. So he's at that point, he's leaving actually during this interview. But I thought I'd add those in just to to give some context and flavor to the whole thing. But anyway, back to the high level comparison between the movies. And you can find links to all the relevant material in the show notes. So Tom, what do you think from just taking a 1,000-foot look at these two movies and how they're alike and how they're different?
Well, I mean, you suggested War Machine, which I think it's a great movie. It's a great one to talk about. But the reason I suggested comparing it with Charlie Wilson's War is that they're quite similar movies in lots of sort of broad respects, in that they're both comedies, they're both kind of satires of a kind, both about wars in Afghanistan, both kind of primarily set in Afghanistan to a certain extent. Charlie Wilson's War is obviously about the CIA sponsorship of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s, whereas War Machine is set 2-3 decades later, around 2009, 2010. But they are quite similar in industrial respects. Like I say, they're both from the same genre. They both have A-list actors in them. They both weren't made for a huge amount of money. There's a lot to compare with the two. There's a lot of similarities there, but politically they are so very, very different. Charlie Wilson's War is a lionization of the CIA and of this congressman, Charlie Wilson, who helped get the funding for the Mujahideen up to hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas War Machine is a pretty savage indictment of the American war in Afghanistan since 2001. It really portrays it as futile, as ridiculously complex, as there being no overall aim in mind, let alone a way of measuring whether that aim is even being accomplished. There's the wonderful sequence at the beginning where they're talking about all these different assessments that have gone on. And, even McChrystal himself, he tours the country to do his own assessment of the situation. But it's like, well, you can do as many assessments as you want. They're all going to come back saying this war is essentially unwinnable and pointless. But obviously, McChrystal didn't believe that, didn't want to believe that. And so that's what War Machine portrays. So I thought they're both very good movies. I think they're both very funny. They're both very well made, pretty well acted, and yet politically so very, very different.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I would add that I think they are really both about war policies and an attempt to sell a war policy. I was looking a little bit into the context of them, and the timing is interesting, I thought. Let me see if you agree with this. Just find my notes here. So Charlie Wilson's War, the book came out in April 2003. So this is just weeks after the Iraq invasion.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really thought of it in that context before. And, I think obviously there are protests going on like all over the world. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people, millions of people who are not happy about this invasion. So I think to bring out this book, which, as you said, lionizes interventions, you could say, they center in on one person. But overall, it's really about, look at the good we've done,
Yeah. I mean, George Cryle's book is definitely pro-interventionist. You can certainly say that much about it. I mean, I will say the book is a little bit more hard-hitting than the film, and maybe in a bit we can get into some of the reasons for that. But yeah, it's certainly a pro-interventionist book that came out just in the wake of the Iraq invasion. So you do have to wonder at the timing there, whether this was, George Cryle's plan or whether this is more the publisher trying to capitalize on something. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be a stretch on my part. And I haven't read the book, so I'm going to definitely defer to you on that. But then the movie is released, and it's released on November 30th, 2007. It was originally scheduled to go out on Christmas, and they moved it back a few weeks. And at this point in time, the Iraq War is in tatters. There's another anti-war sentiment, or you could either continuing or strengthening. And the other thing is that there is one of the most important presidential primaries of our time, I would say, is happening at this time. And interestingly, the reason why I dug into this is because I thought, why did they make why did they give Rudy Giuliani such a sort of a lot of mentions and almost like a like an offshoot key role? They set him right in the middle of the an important part of the movie, and I thought that's kind of strange. And then when I dug into it, I remembered that Rudy Giuliani was running for president at that point in time, and there was a sort of spectacular flame out right around the same time that this movie came out. And there were a number of different, definitely campaigns against Rudy Giuliani, because you have to remember that in the years leading up to this movie, the conventional wisdom was that the 2008 election was going to be Hillary Clinton versus Rudy Giuliani. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people really thought that's who the two candidates were going to be. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. But I think I don't know, maybe the Clintons got their hand into this and injected a little political hit on Rudy Giuliani. But I don't know, maybe not, because he wasn't exactly a bad guy in this. But if he had succeeded in this prosecution that he was pursuing at the time, well, then Charlie Wilson would have been knocked out of the game. And I guess the conclusion maybe you're supposed to draw is that, oh, thank God that he didn't get prosecuted by Rudy Giuliani, because if he had, then, none of this would have happened, this intervention, and maybe even the fall of the Soviet Union wouldn't have happened. Now, I think we both agree that story is exaggerated at best.
It's a stretch, but yeah. I understand what you're saying. That kind of implicit narrative is there in the film. I mean, for those who don't know the story, Charlie Wilson was a fairly hard-drinking, womanizing congressman from Texas, but a Democrat. He was essentially a liberal Democrat, but kind of a liberal hawk. He's very pro-Israel, very pro-US foreign policy. In the midst of him getting involved with the CIA to raise money for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, he is subject to this ethics probe, I guess you'd call it, relating to primarily whether or not he'd taken cocaine in a Las Vegas hotel room. He was ultimately, I think, charged but never indicted, though in the film they don't really make that clear. They just, at one point, the investigation ultimately gets dropped and Charlie's, celebrating and everything's okay again. But yeah, the probe, the investigation was being run by Rudy Giuliani, who at that point was kind of just some guy at the Justice Department. This was before everyone knew who Rudy Giuliani was. So it's certainly interesting that they made a point of putting his name in there in the script. It was very, very clear this is being run by Giuliani. This is kind of Charlie Wilson versus Rudy Giuliani. So I think that has to partly be in relation to what you're saying, that, he was a front runner or perceived front runner in the presidential campaign. And also maybe for political reasons. I don't know whether it would be the Clintons who'd get their hands in there, but certainly there were others. I mean, the CIA, let's not forget, the CIA supported this movie. They helped to make it. And they probably, on balance, would have preferred Clinton to Giuliani, maybe. Maybe I'm stretching the truth there. Maybe I'm speculating a little too far.
I'm not actually sure on that one, but I do know that someone who was at the CIA at the time, John Kiraku, told us in an interview one time that this is the point at which the CIA became very politicized, and there was pretty much a split down the middle a little bit later on, where about half of the people at the CIA supported Hillary and half of them supported, of course, McCain at this point, because he ended up being the candidate. And one person, John Brennan, who supported Obama. That just for a little context of information that we have. So yeah, there were a lot, but it wasn't unanimous anyway, support for Hillary. So, but anyway, maybe I shouldn't have even thrown that in here, but I'm sort of a stickler for context. I like to look at what was happening at periods of time, because I'm always wondering why they do this. But I think that may have just been injected a little sort of, I don't even know if it was in the book. Maybe it was, or I'm not sure. But they gave it a prominent point. That's what kind of struck me. one of the most memorable scenes in the movie is when the what's his name, Gust from the CIA,
Yeah.
comes to Charlie Wilson's congressional office, and he has to keep leaving the room because Charlie Wilson's aides and staff keep coming in, telling him, giving him updates about this Rudy Giuliani investigation. And he sends Gust out of the room to talk to them. Then he brings Gust back into the room. And during this point in time, Gust says, I guess this is a spoiler maybe for people, a little bit of a spoiler. Gus has brought him a bottle of whiskey, and sort of at the end, toward the end of this scene, Gus reveals that he's been listening to the whole conversation from outside the room because he has bugged the whiskey bottle. And so that's definitely one of the most memorable scenes. So that makes you remember the Giuliani part too. But anyway, so I think.
And just going on a kind of anecdotal basis, everyone I've spoken to about this movie, about Charlie Wilson's War, mentions the Giuliani thing. Everyone remembers that, oh, it was Giuliani who was investigating him. Hang on, what is there something to that? What's that about? So it's certainly not just you and me. Believe me, everyone I've spoken to about this film remembers that it was Giuliani and remembers that scene. You're right.
That's interesting. I wonder if that was in the book or if that was sort of just.
It is mentioned in the book that it was
Okay.
Giuliani heading the investigation, but it's not like a massively significant plot point. And in the film, it doesn't really have. I mean, what does it matter who's heading the investigation, given that it ultimately goes away? So, I'm sure there was a choice. There was a creative choice somewhere along the line as to whether they included his name or not. And for whatever reasons, we can only speculate. The choice was made. Yeah, let's foreground Giuliani. Let's make it clear to everyone that's who it was.
And the thing is, Tom, it happens at a point in time when these massive scandals about Giuliani are coming one after the other, and the press is, super amplifying them. One of his right hand man, I think his last name was Carrick, gets. I don't want to go into the details, but it's clear that there are some political hits being put out on Giuliani. Not that that's hard to do, mind you. The guy's, kind of an easy mark, but.
Yeah, plenty to aim at with that. But nonetheless, I think you're right. There were some. Certainly, there were some people within parts of the establishment who didn't like Giuliani and were trying to make it difficult for him. So you have to wonder, did anyone have a quiet word in the screenwriter's ear? Because these things do happen.
And I probably wouldn't have thought about this unless I had listened to some of your analysis of, how much involvement in some of these movies our, let's say, War Machine. That's a bad choice of phrases for this episode. Our national security state has in the entertainment world. So anyway, I probably spent too much time on that, but I thought it was interesting. Now, I say that there are policy objectives related to the Charlie Wilson War, and I think in a different way. The same is true of the War Machine, because this is the point in time when Obama is coming into office. He's made promises to ramp down the Iraq War and to place the focus on the good war, in his opinion, the Afghanistan war. And he actually wants to put more focus on Pakistan too at the time. So, and we also have one particular general, General Petraeus, who is he's sort of the prince of the surge strategy. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail on the surge, but at that point, the surge was sort of going to be the savior of the Iraq War, because the Iraq War is in tatters at this point. And Afghanistan, nobody understands why we're there. The focus has been taken off of that war, and the anti-war sentiment is pretty high at this point. And the military leadership, and that includes the Secretary of Defense, he's basically saying things like, we're never leaving Afghanistan. They see this as a very long-term occupation, and they want it to be sort of like a Korea. We establish base there, and we keep a fair sized force there. And they really are going to have a hard time selling this to the public and to, people on the other side of the foreign policy, um, who have a different stance on foreign policy at this point. So the surge is the thing that they're using to, oh, there's a phrase that I can't think of, but to basically make a success out of a disastrous failure. And I think that's one of the main things that Hastings is pushing back against in the book. And the movie is pretty, I'm told, is pretty faithful to the book, The Operators. So I guess that's sort of it's a comparison. There's a similarity between the movies here, but it's also a big contrast. One of them is trying to sell or, boost in an intervention policy, and the other one is pushing back against a different policy to sell or boost or lengthen some war. So I thought that part was interesting too.
Well, for sure. And I mean, we should draw a basic distinction here between the Soviet-Afghan war, where the US were fighting via proxies. They were using the Mujahideen as their troops on the ground. And the US war in Afghanistan, which is obviously a full-scale military occupation, or at least an attempted full-scale military occupation by US troops themselves, along with others from NATO. So, yeah, it's interesting that they're both based on books, and books that came out within a few years of each other, of course. But one is trying to, I mean, it's a piece of historical revisionism. The film more so than the book with Charlie Wilson's War. The book is a bit more accurate, like I say. But the film is just, how great was this? Look at this wonderful, wacky adventure with this hard-drinking congressman who, likes a good time, but he's also in league with the CIA. So it's glamorizing the CIA, it's glamorizing the political establishment to some extent. And it's, in many respects, quite pro-Democrat, because our central figure, our protagonist, Charlie Wilson, is a Democrat. Whereas Michael Hastings wasn't arguing from a kind of political party point of view. This had nothing to do with partisanship. This had everything to do with policy. He was saying, look, this policy is already failing, and simply doubling down on it via the surge is just going to, if you like, amplify the worst aspects of this. He was very, like you say, pushing back against that. And not, I think, for political motives. I think he was doing it because he genuinely thought, from what he'd seen and what people had told him, this is a failure that's only going to get worse. So the books themselves,
I think that's
you know what I mean? The books themselves that the films are based on are quite different sorts of books in many respects. One is very or fairly partisan and clearly pro-interventionist. The other one is very critical and not partisan really at all.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made about the movie being, it distorts the real story. When you start digging into what really happened in our intervention in the 80s, actually the late 70s, in Afghanistan by backing the Mujahideen. When you start to dig into the details of that, you're like, this movie is kind of fiction.
For one thing, it starts 3 years too late. It starts in the sort of early 80s.
For a good reason, though. The reason why it starts too late is that they place it after the Soviet invasion instead of before, which is truly when we did start to intervene. And I think that's why they changed the timeline there, I think.
Well, they changed quite a lot from the actual historical record.
Right.
I mean, no, I suppose we've got time to get into some of this quite simply. I did a quite lengthy study of all of the films about the Soviet-Afghan war and found that every single one of them was to some extent state-sponsored by a government, and that all of them, regardless of which government it was, which country it was, and bear in mind there are some from the Russian side as well as some from the NATO side, they all maintained the same basic stereotypes, i.e. that the Arabs were essentially just cannon fodder. They aren't portrayed well in any of these films except one called The Beast of War. That the Russians are kind of brutal, savage invaders who went in there just to kind of abuse the local Afghan people for no apparent reason, which isn't what happened at all. The Soviets invaded because their proxy client communist government, which was led by a guy called Nur Mohammad Taraki, he was killed by his number two and overthrown. And the Soviets believed his replacement, Hafizullah Amin, was at least not trustworthy, and they suspected he might be working with the CIA. So they invaded to depose him and reinstall their proxy client government. None of this is mentioned in any of the films.
Yeah.
None of this. Let alone the fact that the US government was, in some ways, covertly supplying and supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan at least 6 months before the invasion. So all of that context is thrown completely out the window, and instead this just looks like, brutal, savage Russians who just hate Arabs and wanted to massacre them, and that's why they invaded. And, the CIA went in there afterwards as some kind of humanitarian gesture. I mean, that's the thing that really, really distorts history, is this whole thing about, the refugee camps and so on. And sure, there were massive refugee camps in Pakistan as people were fleeing Afghanistan. I'm not disputing that at all. But the CIA's motives weren't humanitarian. The CIA's motives were to kind of mess with the Soviets and kill some Russians and hopefully just turn the whole thing into a mess like Vietnam. So, yeah, all of that gets thrown out the window, and instead we get this very simplistic narrative. The other major thing that they get wrong, if you like, is that CIA approached Charlie Wilson. They recruited him as an asset on the Hill to raise money for this covert operation. Whereas in the film, Charlie Wilson is sort of persuaded into this by his friend Joanne Herring, this very rich Texan woman. And it's all about him asking to, he asks for someone from the CIA to come talk to him. If you read George Kryle's book, that's not the way it happened. It happened the other way round. Wilson was effectively recruited as an asset by the CIA, none of which is mentioned in the film at all. You don't get that impression whatsoever. The relationship between him and Gust is not of an asset and a handler. It's a kind of like a cop buddy film. It's like a Lethal Weapon or something. It's, two good old boys having a fun adventure. So they completely distort the history from almost every angle as to what actually happened and in what order.
And they went to great lengths to do that too, making the character of Gus as such a radical, and the CIA is pretty much uninterested in doing any kind of messing with Afghanistan, except for Gust. He's the one guy in the agency who, has had this cause, but no one would listen to him. And he's so ecstatic because he even says at one point, I think I've found the one person in Congress who cares about, their common cause. It becomes a core, aspect of the movie. So they really went to great lengths to change the way that the origin of this. And it's interesting because Zbigniew Brzezinski kind of gives away the whole game on this, though he tries to backtrack later. But in 1998, he gives this interview with a French magazine. And, they ask him about it. And again, I'll link this in the show notes, but I'm just going to try to skim this, give you a couple of quotes. Brzezinski says, yes, someone translated this, and it's on the University of Arizona website. So I think I've never seen anyone challenge the French translation or anything. So he says, yes, this is Brzezinski. Yes, according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began in 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. And then they asked him the question, despite the risk, you are an advocate of this covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired this Soviet entry into the war and looked for a way to provoke it. Brzezinski says, it wasn't quite like that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. And then the question is, when the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting that they intended to fight against secret U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, nobody believed them. However, there was an element of truth in this. You don't regret any of this today? And Brzezinski says, regret what? The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter essentially, quote, we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. And there's a couple more. Question, and neither do you regret having supported Islamic fundamentalism, which has given arms and advice to future terrorists? Brzezinski says, what's more important than world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, some agitated Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? He's getting pretty defensive now. The question is, some agitated Muslims? But it has been said and repeated, Islamic fundamentalism represents a world menace today. Brzezinski says, nonsense. It is said that the West has a global policy in regard to Islam. That is stupid. There isn't a global Islam. Look at Islam in a rational manner, without demagoguery or emotionalism. It is the leading religion of the world with 1.5 billion followers. But what there is in common among fundamentalist Saudi Arabia, moderate Morocco, militarist Pakistan, pro-Western Egypt, or secularist Central Asia? Nothing more than what unites Christian countries. Anyway, you get the gist of, this is 1998, this is before 9/11, and I will mention, without getting into, maybe I'll add an audio clip here there's a couple of interviews after this where Brzezinski really tries to walk back this triumphalism that he's proud of his, scheming here. And, later people ask him, well, this led to Al-Qaeda and 9/11. And, he tries to backtrack. He says that the quote's not accurate. And there's a Real News interview with him in 2010 where Paul Jay interviews him. And these objections that Brzezinski made, he actually goes and digs through the documents, and he challenges Brzezinski a couple of times, and they correspond back and forth after the interview. And Brzezinski kind of dodges it. I think it's very clear that Paul Jay's assertions were accurate, and Brzezinski is fine. He nitpicks a couple of things here and there, and then he eventually says, well, the Soviets hadn't yet invaded. They didn't invade until December 1979, but they had special forces there before. They were really there earlier, and so on and so forth. And then he also says, well, we really didn't start sending lethal aid until the Reagan years or whatever. We were only sending non-lethal aid, which is another very common American assertion to make. But I think it's important because I think Brzezinski is the one who completely debunks the Charlie Wilson War movie, I'm adding a clip from that Real News interview here, and I'm adding it after the conversation during the editing process.
There's a famous interview you gave to a French paper where you talked about the decision to advise Jimmy Carter to arm the jihadists in Afghanistan against the communist government in Afghanistan. And you're quoted as saying that this would help induce or would lead to the Soviets intervening in Afghanistan, which might lead to their Vietnam. Is that a legitimate quote?
That's not an accurate quote. I don't know, what yours is based on. But there are two different aspects here that are kind of connected. One, Robert Gates revealed in his memoirs accurately that before the Soviets staged the formal invasion of Afghanistan, but they were already in Afghanistan with special forces and so forth, we increased financial assistance to the Mujahideen. It was mostly for the acquisition presumably weapons. And then after they came in, when the Soviets came in, I did send the president a memo saying, yes, they're entering into Afghanistan at a time of turmoil in Iran and in the whole Persian region, Gulf region as a consequence, potentially. We have a chance to give the Soviets their Vietnam.
Because the interview says this was before the Soviet invasion.
That's not right.
That leads to Carter's decision to do this.
That's not right. That's just a factual right. I mean, the archives are open at the Carter Center. You can send someone down to have them checked.
Some of the veteran journalists I've talked to about this, they think this is overstated, that the real decision that created today's world was Reagan's decision to give Stinger missiles, that early decision really wasn't as significant.
Look, we were already helping, and that was an escalation, and a constructive one in my judgment. In fact, since I was no longer in the government, but I had some experience in dealing with this problem, I was asked to participate in a meeting which involved Secretary Schultz, Director Casey, and Secretary Weinberger, and I was there. And I fully endorsed, again, I was not a decision maker, but I was being consulted. I fully endorsed the decision to give the Mujahideen the Stingers, and it was quite important in hastening the end of the conflict, not in deciding the conflict, because actually the fact is, even though we helped the Mujahideen, they would have continued fighting without our help, because they're also getting a lot of money from the Persian Gulf, from the Arab states, and they weren't going to quit. They didn't decide to fight because we urged them to. They're fighters, and they prefer to be independent. They just happen to have a curious complex. They don't like foreigners with guns in their country. And they're going to fight the Soviets. But giving them Stingers was a very important forward step in defeating the Soviets, and that's all to the good as far as I'm concerned.
So U.S. support for the Mujahideen only begins after the Russians invade, not before?
With arms, absolutely afterwards. No question about it. Show me some documents of the country.
We sent the published interview with Le Nouvel Observateur to Dr. Brzezinski, and he responded. As far as the French interview is concerned, it was not an interview, but excerpts from an interview that was originally supposed to be published in full, but which they never checked with me for approval in the form that it did appear. We then went back to Robert Gates' book, From the Shadows. Although Dr. Brzezinski acknowledges in our interview that U.S. funding was for the purchase of weapons, as does Gates, they both make a point of stating that there was no direct supply of lethal weapons to the Afghan insurgency. President Carter's finding authorized, quote, the provision, either unilaterally or through third countries, of support to the Afghan insurgents in the form of either cash or non-military supplies. But Gates states in another paragraph, by the end of August, Pakistani President Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq was pressuring the United States for arms and equipment for the insurgents in Afghanistan. When Turner, then director of the CIA, heard this, he urged the DO to get moving in providing more help to the insurgents. They responded with several enhancement options, including communications equipment for the insurgents via the Pakistanis or the Saudis, funds for the Pakistanis to purchase lethal military equipment for the insurgents, and providing a like amount of lethal equipment ourselves for the Pakistanis to distribute to the insurgents. According to security analysts we've consulted, this could have been a violation of Carter's authorization to supply only cash and non-military support, which might explain the ambiguity. There's nothing in Gates' book that directly connects Brzezinski with the decision to provide such lethal weapons. We sent the relevant chapter of Gates' book to Dr. Brzezinski for comment, and he replied, prior to the overt Soviet invasion, though the Soviets were covertly already engaged in Afghanistan, we did decide to provide financial assistance to the resistance. After the overt invasion, we provided more direct military assistance.
Actually, I, to be honest, quite radically disagree with you. I think that Nouvel Observateur article and interview is unreliable in the extreme.
Oh, really? I want
Because
to hear about that, yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, firstly, Brzezinski has denied it, and no one's ever released a recording or anything else that substantiates whether the editor of that article or Brzezinski is telling the truth. So we can't really know. But if the only person who was interviewed for the article denies that he said those things or said them in those ways, you have to cast some doubt on it. Secondly, a lot of the things that Brzezinski supposedly said in that interview, and may have actually said, to me sounds like boasting. It sounds like someone who 20 years after the fact looked back on it and said, oh, how can I paint myself in the best possible light? I can make myself out to be some kind of geopolitical genius and play into that whole notion that he kind of somehow saw all of this coming, which I just think is nonsense. For one thing, he's wrong. The Soviets had no interest in invading Afghanistan in the summer of 1979. Taraki was asking the Soviets to invade, well, not invade, but to bring in military support to support the central government in Kabul, and they refused. They said they thought the prospects for communism in Afghanistan were very poor, largely because you have a severe literacy problem in the country. So how do you indoctrinate a bunch of, I'm not being trying to stereotype, but a bunch of rural religious people in a secular 20th century ideology? They just thought this is never going to happen. This isn't going to work. So Brzezinski's claiming that, oh, yeah, I knew we were increasing the likelihood of them invading. Well, if you look at the Soviet documents, that isn't what happened. I've never been able to find any copy of this memo he supposedly sent to Carter in the middle of 1979 saying this will induce a Soviet invasion. And I've checked every archive I can find on this. As to the thing about lethal weapons, they absolutely were sending, or through the proxies in Pakistan, sending weapons to the Mujahideen before the Soviet invasion. He's lying about that. I found a document from the Special Coordination Committee. This is the so-called secret team within, the upper echelons of the US government. And this is what you might call the deep state, right? These were meetings between people from CIA, State Department, DOD, Department of Energy, FBI, and so on. But they were very compartmentalized. So only some of the people were in certain parts of these meetings. So this is how the deep state operates, okay? And one of these memos that I found from before the invasion says we need to liaise with the British and the Pakistanis over increasing the military aid to the Mujahideen. Well, how can they increase it if they weren't already doing it? So he's certainly lying about that. But you see what I mean? I think Brzezinski is bigging himself up in some of these comments, assuming he said them, which he may well have done. I think he may be flattering himself. Also, that memo about giving the Soviets their own Vietnam, Brzezinski didn't write that. One of his staffers did. So
I didn't know that either.
He's lying about a whole bunch of stuff here and making himself out to be far more important and prescient and intelligent than I think he really was. Nonetheless, it is certainly true they were militarily supporting the Mujahideen before the invasion. That much is indisputable at this point. So there's quite a lot going on there. That line about what's more important, some stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Eastern Europe, that was actually in one of the draft scripts for Charlie Wilson's War. It's something that I think Gust says in that scene at the end between Charlie and Gust on the balcony.
Yeah.
And it's not in the film, as I recall.
Somebody zapped it.
I don't know why. I don't know who.
It was just, maybe it was a more innocent edit, but that's interesting. I'm glad that you brought all that up because I definitely don't want to propagate this narrative if it's not exactly accurate.
Well, people can go and look for themselves. I've done a podcast on this and I linked up all the source material. If they disagree with me, fine, disagree with me. Maybe you think that interview is credible and Brzezinski did say all of those things. But I suppose what I'm saying is, whether he said them or not, the historical record contradicts him on a number of points. So I don't think we should just sort of take that interview as truth.
Okay.
I think it's more complex than that.
I'm good with that. And I'll get links to the things that you're referring to, put them in the show notes. And also the 2010, the Real News interview, which does some challenging and back and forth. And but Brzezinski definitely says it's inaccurate. But in his defenses, he doesn't claim that he didn't say it. So it's a little confusing.
Well, that's what I mean. How can we tell, really, whether he said those things or not?
Right.
We don't have any objective proof of that. Maybe he said them and didn't mean them. Maybe he didn't say them in quite that way. It's a difficult one. But I always like going to the actual government paper trail and seeing, okay, well, if you're claiming you wrote this memo, where is this memo? And do these memos actually back up what you're saying or not? I think it's always important to do that rather than trust media interviews. I find the paper trail a more substantive, more reliable record.
I think we have the second net memo, right, to Carter, but not that first one, which is, I guess, the most relevant one.
I've never been able to find that first one, even in like massive collections of documents from, the Carter Library and what have you.
Yeah, I don't doubt you. I was just trying to make sure I had the story straight. I think we do have the second one, but not the first, right?
Yeah, the second one, which is like it's essentially a memo written by one of Brzezinski's staffers a couple of days after the invasion at the end of 1979, where he presents a menu of options, like what are the different options we can take in response to this invasion. One of which, interestingly enough, I think this will interest you, after the Church Committee and all of those investigations in the 70s into US intelligence and covert war and covert operations and so on, they placed some restrictions on the CIA. Yeah. For example, they weren't supposed to be allowed to assassinate people anymore. Now, Reagan actually lifted those in 85, 86, but that memo that was sent in late 79, this menu of options, one of the options is to remove all of these restrictions on CIA covert operations. That they were already, at that point, only like 2-3 years after these restrictions had been put in place, they were trying to exploit the invasion in order to have them lifted. And ultimately, Reagan lifted them a few years later, entirely because of it will make it easier to win in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that is interesting. You think that might actually have been one of the main goals, is to lift those restrictions? And they were using this scenario as a reason for that? Are you going that far, or are you just mentioning it as a point of interest?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm really not sure.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't surprise me. Let me put it that way. The CIA certainly didn't like these restrictions being placed on them. They didn't like Carter's ban on assassinations. And I'm sure there were people in the CIA establishment thinking, what kind of scenario, what kind of situation can we use as a pretext to get rid of these restrictions? And ultimately, they succeeded in that. And let's face it, Reagan basically just did what George Bush told him to when it came to the intelligence agencies. And George Bush is a former director of the CIA. So yeah, it adds up, but I don't know.
Yeah. I think one conclusion we can draw is that the CIA played a much bigger role than the movie portrayed, and earlier than they claim it began. Because I think the movie sets this in the early 80s, right? When this project by Charlie Wilson begins. I don't know if they actually say what year it was.
They don't say what year it was, but Wilson, most of this actually took place, all the parts that we see in the first act of the movie took place in 84, when the CIA had already been doing something in Afghanistan for at least 5 years by that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, they do skip over that big significant chunk of history. And that is also a chunk of history that most historians somewhat skip over. A lot of them leap from that point of, there was some kind of CIA involvement, and then the Soviets invaded, and then they kind of fast forward to the point when the CIA starts sending in all the Stinger missiles and everything in the mid-80s. But that period in the early 80s, there was a war going on. There was stuff happening. There was a covert war on the CIA's side, and the Soviets were there shooting up Afghanistan, but they kind of ignore all of that because it doesn't fit in with their desired narrative, and so they can carefully avoid the fact that Charlie Wilson was a CIA asset. There is one other thing, if you want to get into it, that was in one of the earlier scripts but gets removed. And I think this is, if anything, this is what the CIA would have removed from the script, assuming they did. I don't have any documents proving this, but if you look at the draft script and how they developed, a narrative emerges, let's say. There's a sequence where Mike Vickers, the weapons expert, CIA weapons expert, is giving Charlie a briefing. And he's explaining, we've got all these different groups and we're having some luck in the Panjshir Valley and so on. And then Charlie at the end goes, right, time to go get our money, time to go to the committee and get funding for all this. In the original version of that scene, they mention Al-Qaeda and they mention a guy called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
They do?
Yeah. Now, when Charlie goes to Joanne Herring's house and sees a film?
Yeah.
That film is about Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
Huh.
It's essentially a biopic of him. And for those who don't know who Hekmatyar is, well, at that point, he was a kind of Gucci-wearing, narco-trafficking sociopath. He liked to skin people alive, sold a lot of heroin. He received a huge proportion of the CIA funding for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He received the largest proportion, or his gang did. He spent most of the war fighting with other Afghan factions over territory and power, rather than actually fighting the Soviets.
When you say factions, do you mean other warlords, or do you mean tribal?
I mean anyone he kind of picked a fight with, really.
Okay.
His gang spent most of that war riding around Afghanistan, picking fights with people for no obvious reason other than the greater glory of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So you can understand the CIA are a bit embarrassed about this. And they did try and kill him in a drone strike in 2002, 2003, the early years of the war on terror. And they failed, they missed. And now he's tried to sort of reform himself, and he's trying to paint himself as some kind of Afghan statesman. The guy's, like I say, the guy's a psychopath. He's one of the worst human beings ever to live. But you can see why the CIA wouldn't want people looking this guy up and thinking, hang on, why were the CIA supporting this horrible human being back in the 1980s? And I'm guessing that's why his name gets scotched from the script, even though it's a film about him that gets Charlie Wilson involved in this in the first place. Oh no, let's ignore who the film is actually about, because that's kind of quite an embarrassing secret for the CIA. So you can see why I think that's probably what the CIA scotched from the script.
And that was a pretty prominent scene in the movie when he goes to her house, and when he gets a call from her when he's with the other young woman who's anyway, but she's jealous. She says, "Oh, that's a girlfriend you didn't tell me about," and she tells him, to come to her house to this party. It was also a big party, and they throw a whole bunch of other things in there about her and her infamous parties. But you're right; they don't say anything about what the movie's about, do they?
No, they just mention that this is a film that some friend of hers has made about Afghanistan.
And they completely distract you with the women auctioning themselves and, the grandeur of the whole thing. You kind of forget all about the reason why you went there.
Yeah. Whereas if you read George Kryle's book, which we know Aaron Sorkin did before writing this script, it's perfectly clear who this film is about. He talks about the film, who made it, what Hekmatyar said in it.
Yeah.
They knew this. They knew all of this, but it doesn't make it into the final film. And I think that's a great example of just how this whole process of national security cinema operates. It's not about the CIA commissioned this film in any way, but once the wheels were moving, once a script was written, they got in there and they made sure there was nothing in there that embarrassed them or revealed any secrets that they didn't want revealing. And as a result, we ended up with a fairly shallow film. I mean,
I would say very shallow, yeah.
It's a good film in a lot of respects, but it's very superficial. No one who watches that is going to come away with any significant education in the Soviet-Afghan War. So,
and especially now. Now, I saw this movie when it came out in the theaters, and I was just talking to my friend we went together to this, and I was sort of probing him about, does he remember what his impressions were? Because we probably both had similar impressions. Like, I remember I loved it. I loved the movie. And I may have even bought into the hero thing, because at this point in time, I was just still I was against the Iraq war for sure, but I didn't understand the war in Afghanistan. And I definitely didn't understand things well enough to go like, oh my God, I can't even believe they did this, even though you can enjoy the movie itself because it's great entertainment. But when I watched it again recently, I had an entirely different reaction to it. Oh my gosh, yeah. In fact, I was almost insulted by it. I mean, I'm still, I appreciate the art of it, but not only did I now realize how much the story had been twisted, but the other thing that I just couldn't shake was just the immense irony of the whole thing now. The way they portrayed the Soviets, for example, as they really went whole hog on making them into the evil empire kind of thing. They just, they strafed villages and they indiscriminately, and they killed all these civilians, and they did. Okay, so that's, but how one-sided it was. And I mean, who is the person, or who is the entity actually doing that right now? Who do the civilians of Afghanistan loathe and want to leave their country now? Who's doing drone strikes and night raids, and who's doing that now? It's us. And I thought, oh God, what such unintentional irony in this movie now, and a lot of other things too. Just the downplaying the CIA role. I mean, I felt insulted by that. Actually, insulted by intelligence, in that the CIA didn't really have any interest in this operation. They had to be sort of not dragged into it, but by some lucky strike of serendipity, they became involved in it. All that, it's insulting to your intelligence. It just is.
Oh, it absolutely is. And yeah, the way it starts, where it's basically just like Gust and three other guys, even says at one point, the CIA doesn't really have an Afghan policy.
Right.
But we're working hard on it. And it's like, you kind of had an Afghan policy since at least the middle of 1979 and possibly a couple of years before that. So, yeah, that's just an outright lie, isn't it? But it fits in with, it's a trend I've noticed post-Vietnam. War movies used to be about armies fighting other armies, right? You'd have 1,000 good guys and 1,000 bad guys. Okay, your story would focus on a much more limited number, but that was still how a war movie worked. Since late 70s, certainly into the 80s, war movies and action movies in general have focused on a much smaller number of people. The notion is always that the Western heroes are small in number, that we are up against the odds, that we are outnumbered by the opponent, that it's, 4 white guys up against 1 million Arabs, that kind of image. If you think, Lone Survivor, 12 Strong, all of these special forces movies we've had in the last decade, it's always, a small handful of special forces guys up against hundreds or thousands of, an angry horde. And that is, again, like you say, a gross deception and a ugly, horrible lie, because the reality is NATO is the most powerful military institution on earth. No one messes with NATO, really, when it comes down to it. We're not up against the odds at all. We are the ones almost determining the odds for everyone else. But cinematically, it's always portrayed the other way around. It's always that, we're, through sheer pluckiness and bravery, that's how we overcome the odds. When it's, in reality, it's because we have much more money and a far greater military capacity than they do.
And imperial ambitions and all
the rest of it. But Charlie Wilson's War is a great example of that, of the notion of, it was just a small handful of guys on our side versus, the might of the Soviet Union on their side. But we overcame because, whatever, we drank a lot of whiskey, and it's not even all that clear how they win in the end. That's the problem. The film is kind of so shallow, it doesn't even really explain how the CIA prevailed. And in truth, again, this is another thing that the film gets wrong purely from a point of view of historical fact. The Soviets withdrew, but the communist government stayed in place for another 3 or 4 years. And then you get the Afghan civil war and the rise of the Taliban and the rest of it. But the Soviets didn't actually lose the Soviet-Afghan war. Whereas the film makes it like, they lose completely, suffered this humiliating defeat and had to withdraw. That's not actually what happened.
Yeah, I mean, and they portray it as having changed the course of the war and sort of won the war, if you will. But they also, not only that, but we brought about the downfall of the Soviet Empire, just
one drunk congressman and a couple of CIA agents took down the Soviet Union. That kind of is the story that they're telling, but it's completely untrue.
Yeah. And either Gust or Joanne Herring says something to Charlie Wilson at the end, like, you see, look what you've done. Amazing what you've done. Like, oh my God. Oh, on my second watching, I was just like cringing at that point. But yeah, I mean, it's so interesting for so many ways. And Charlie Wilson himself, the real Charlie Wilson, and Joanne Herring, they totally went along with it. I watched I watched it kind of quickly. There's a little documentary about the making of Charlie Wilson's War, and the real Charlie Wilson is in it, and Joanne Herring, who I think is still around and still doing the same kinds of work that she's been doing all those years. They both chime in. They're interviewed, and they're all in on this narrative.
Oh, totally. I mean, they did have. It has been reported in the press in a few places how they had some input on the script, but I'm guessing that was on things like, again, if you read early drafts of the script, you find there's a scene where Charlie Wilson is drink driving over the Key Bridge, and he crashes into another car full of people. But in the real story, he's so drunk he doesn't realize he's hit another car. He just thinks he's hit the barrier at the side of the road, and he just drives off into the night. In the film, he sort of stops and checks, is anyone hurt, before then scurrying off into the night. That scene, removed entirely, doesn't appear in the last version of the script, doesn't appear in the film. I think that's the sort of thing that Charlie Wilson had taken out of the script. I can't believe he'd have any reason to mess with the stuff about Al-Qaeda and Hekmatyar and all of that. I'm convinced that's the CIA's influence.
Yeah.
I know Joanne Herring wasn't overwhelmingly happy as being portrayed as, what's a polite way of putting this, as a sexual libertarian, which she is somewhat in the film, but even more so in earlier drafts of the script. So I'm guessing that's kind of what she had watered down and diluted. But yeah, those two, they both had quite a lot of input on the script, and they both helped make the movie. So they totally seem to have bought into this false narrative that they brought down communism or something.
So I guess one more detail about the movie that I found interesting, because like I said, I watched a documentary about the making of the movie, and then there were some other things that I think it might have been Adam Curtis's. He did the Power of Nightmares.
Yeah.
And he also did Bitter Lake?
Mm-hmm.
So I had watched that a long time ago. I went through some of that again, but there's some discrepancies between, who provided funding and who provided weapons. Like, we often, and still do, use a third-party country to actually purchase, sometimes fund, or just purchase and transport weapons for covert operations, right? Just to, they're cutouts. So in the movie, another very memorable scene where they're talking to an Israeli arms dealer, I guess, right? And they make a big point that Israel and Egypt, or Israel and Pakistan, right?
Well, this is the thing. It's an alliance between the US and the Saudis are providing the money. The Pakistanis are providing the logistics, if you like, of how do we actually get this stuff into southern Afghanistan. The Israelis were manufacturing the weapons alongside the Egyptians, because they could manufacture weapons that would look like they'd been seized from the Soviet army rather than American weapons. So it was a kind of an alliance between all of them.
All right, then I guess that does match up with some of the other documentaries that I watch, although I think it's Brzezinski who mentions that China was also involved. I didn't see any reference to that in the movie. Maybe there was in the book. I didn't dig into the details on that.
China were essentially on Pakistan's side, not really on the American side, if you like. But China at that point had quite a good relationship with Pakistan. Indeed, it's always had a fairly good relationship with Pakistan because of the tension between China and India. So, yeah, China was certainly involved. They were shipping in weapons, and I'm not quite sure whether they were using military advisors or not, but different sources disagree on that point. Another factor is Iran. You've got to not forget, the Iranians had a revolution in 1979, right, while all of this was going on. And when you watch that famous CNN documentary where Brzezinski is interviewed quite extensively about the Soviet-Afghan War, he talks about that they were confronted with this problem of a hostile Iran, and he says, on the northern shore of the Persian Gulf facing us, which suggests that As far as he's concerned, Saudi Arabia is American territory.
Yeah.
Combined with this, communist takeover in Afghanistan. That's how he describes the context of all of this. But yeah, Iran was supporting the Mujahideen as well. That's
and we have Iran-Contra.
Missing. And of course you have Iran-Contra at the same time as well. So it's far more complex than the movie makes out.
Yeah, it's complicated, to put it lightly.
No, I know. I mean, we're both struggling a little bit because there is so much to the Soviet-Afghan war. That's the problem. Afghanistan in the 1980s just became like a playground for every regional power and superpower to pile in there and pursue whatever agenda it was that they were pursuing. I mean, another factor that's completely missing from this is that because the CIA were shipping everything through the south, through Pakistan, they didn't have much influence on the north. Because obviously they couldn't get into the Central Asian republics at that point because they were all Soviet.
Right.
So it was actually MI6 who were running the stuff in the north, in the Panjshir Valley with Ahmed Shah Massoud. Remember this guy? The Northern Alliance, all of that? That was all being run by MI6, who also are completely missing from the film. So, yeah, there's a lot more going on in Afghanistan in the 1980s than this film even touches on. And it's difficult because it is such a long and complex story and there are so many different factors and parties involved in this. But hopefully people are getting an impression of just how complicated and how big this war really was and how everyone was piling in there with their agendas and their ambitions trying to do something. So no wonder it ended up such a horrible mess and it just wrecked the country.
Yeah, just to mention one last thing that is completely left out of this is this sort of the geopolitical geniuses of the time. They've taken up the heartland theory, I think it's called, where the world island and, the control of Afghanistan is, critical to maintaining control of the world or keeping anyone else from controlling the world too. Is it Mackinder is the original?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Brzezinski takes up that theory and it becomes sort of a gospel for some of the foreign policy establishment.
No, sure. In the grand chessboard, he keeps going on about, control of Central Eurasia effectively is the kind of pivot point for Europe, Asia, and Africa. If you look at what's at the center of all of that, it's more or less Afghanistan. And yeah, it is. It's always been an important country, or that patch of land, not necessarily Afghanistan, but, that area has always been very important because it is where all of the trade and therefore all of the military conflict kind of coalesces. It all naturally ends up around there. This is partly why, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the West NATO were so aggressive at trying to take Central Asia. It's because you control Central Asia, at least in Brzezinski and his adherents, his acolytes' point of view. You control Central Asia, you basically control the Eurasian continent and therefore ultimately control the world. And whether that hypothesis is right or not, of course, is another question. But it's certainly, you're right to bring it up because it is, in the 1990s, it became foreign policy gospel in the big Western countries, the big NATO countries. This very much was the strategy that they were pursuing in Asia for the whole of the 1990s.
I'm surprised they didn't interject some of that into this movie because they could have easily, integrated that into their overall narrative of how important this was. So anyway, they chose not to for whatever reason.
I guess because they didn't want people actually looking at maps and figuring things out for themselves.
Yeah, totally on the humanitarian intervention. We're the good guys, the saviors. We were deep into that in 2007. Not that we aren't still, but that mask is falling off pretty rapidly. And that's the end of part 1. Tune in later in the week for part 2. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Tom Secker. Find Tom's work and ways to support that work at spyculture.com and also patreon.com/Tom Secker. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and it's brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or by doing one-time donations on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. Follow me at Joanne Leon. It helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, and that's free. The channel's growing, but we haven't yet reached the required number of subscribers needed for revenue and for the Super Chat feature. Also, if you would, use the thumbs up icon to like the videos, the individual videos. We appreciate that. Subscribe to our podcast on your preferred podcast app. We're on most of them now. We're on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and others. And if you like the podcast, take a minute, leave a nice review. It helps. We also have a page on Facebook. See you next time. Take care, everyone.